The dawn in the Mojave colony did not break with gold, but with a bruised metallic violet that clung to the jagged edges of the Sierra Nevada. Elias woke before the sirens of the extraction mines, his joints popping like dry kindling as he sat up in a room that smelled of stale coffee and rusted iron. He was a man carved from the very earth he worked, rough-handed, grey-eyed, and silent. His life was a rhythmic cycle of survival, yet every morning he detoured from the path to the pits. He walked instead toward the Ghetto of the Stars, a dilapidated sector where the first wave of refugees from the Andromeda Rift had been quarantined. There, in the shadow of a crumbling water tower, waited Kale, a child whose skin was the color of a winter moon and whose legs hung uselessly like broken reeds. The boy was always waiting. He sat on a crate of discarded tech, his large amber eyes reflecting a depth of sorrow that no child should possess. Kyle was an other, a term the townspeople spat like phlegm, yet to Elias he was simply a boy who was being left behind. Without a word, Elias would turn his back, bracing his thick muscles as Kyle leaned forward, thin arms wrapping around the man's neck. The weight was nothing compared to the silence between them, a comfortable gravity that defied the tension of the colony. As Elias lifted him, he felt the faint, rhythmic hum of the boy's secondary heart against his spine, a reminder that they were different species sharing the same air. They began the 2-mile trek toward the interspecies school, a journey through the gauntlet of a world that didn't want either of them. The road was a jagged spine of flint and red dust, punishing to those who traveled it on foot. Every step Elias took kicked up a cloud of grit that coated his lungs, but he never faltered, his boots rhythmic against the scorched earth. People watched from their porches, human miners with hollow eyes and alien refugees with translucent skin, all of them united in their confusion or their scorn. To the humans, Elias was a star lover, a traitor to his own blood for wasting his strength on a creature that couldn't contribute to the quota. To the aliens, he was a curiosity, a predator acting like a protector. Elias ignored the whispers, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun began to bake the valley. He wasn't looking for a medal. He was simply moving forward because stopping felt like a surrender to the cruelty of the times. They passed the rusted husks of old Ford trucks and the sleek, crashed remains of scout ships, a graveyard of two civilizations. Kyle would sometimes tighten his grip when the wind howled through the canyons, making a sound like a dying choir. Elias would respond by shifting the boy's weight higher, a silent gesture of reassurance that meant more than any spoken oath. He didn't know that Kyle was a prince in exile, or that the boy's legs had been shattered by a high-frequency pulse during a palace coup light years away. He only knew that the boy's satchel was light and his spirit was heavy. He saw the way Kyle watched the other children, the ones who could run, and felt a familiar ache in his own chest, a remnant of a life he had lost before the stars fell to earth. The school was nothing more than a reinforced shipping container at the edge of the settlement, a place where the unwanted were taught the basics of a shared language. When they arrived, Elias would carefully lower Kyle into a specialized chair, ensuring the boy's spindly legs were positioned comfortably. He never stayed for a thank you, nor did he expect one. He would simply nod, wipe the sweat from his brow with a greasy rag, and turn back toward the mines. He was a ghost in his own life, a man who found purpose in the friction of his skin against another's burden. He did not see the shimmering distortion in the air behind the school, a cloaking field that hid a pair of obsidian eyes, watching his every move with a terrifying regal intensity. High above the colony, aboard a vessel that looked like a jagged diamond suspended in the clouds, the Queen Mother watched the feed. Her son, the heir to a dominion of 1,000 suns, was being carried like a common sack of grain by a creature who smelled of diesel and dirt. Her advisors whispered for blood, for the defilement of the royal bloodline by the touch of a lesser being. But the queen remained silent, her many-faceted eyes tracking the tremor in Elias's legs as he walked back to his 12-hour shift. She had seen worlds burn for less, but she had never seen a creature risk its social standing for no tangible gain. She gave the order, "Wait. Let the human prove the worth of his species, or let him fail and be the reason they all perish." The heat of the Mojave noon began to shimmer, creating lakes of illusion on the asphalt. Elias was now deep in the mines, swinging a kinetic pick against the stubborn veins of ore, his muscles screaming in protest. He thought of the boy's amber eyes, wondering if he was learning anything that would help him survive a world that saw him as a defect. In the mines, men spoke of the Great Purge, a rumor that the alien fleet was preparing to glass the planet to reclaim their stolen royalty. Elias didn't care for politics or galactic wars. He only cared that the road back to the school would be even hotter in the afternoon. He saved half of his meager water ration, hiding the canteen in his jacket, an unspoken gift for the journey home. As the afternoon sun dipped, casting long skeletal shadows across the desert, Elias returned to the school. He found Kyle sitting by the door, covered in the blue chalk dust of his people. The other children had already left, most of them avoiding Kyle, as if his disability were a contagious curse. Elias didn't ask how his day was. He simply knelt. Kyle climbed on, his movements slow and tired. Today, the boy leaned his head against Elias's shoulder, a rare display of vulnerability that made the man's heart tighten. "Home?" Elias asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. Kyle gave a single sharp nod. They set off again, two silhouettes against a dying sun, unaware that the eyes in the sky were counting every bead of sweat on the man's neck. The walk back was always harder. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of ozone and the distant roar of colony engines. A group of young human men, bored and bitter from the day's labor, stood by the crossroads. They began to hurl stones, not at Elias, but at the freak on his back. One stone grazed Elias's temple, drawing a thin line of crimson that ran down his cheek. He didn't stop. He didn't shout. He simply moved his hand to shield Kyle's head, absorbing the impact of the next rock with his shoulder. He felt Kyle trembling, a vibration of fear that seemed to resonate with the very earth. Elias merely tightened his hold. "Don't look," he whispered. "Just hold on. We're almost there." In the hidden corridors of the Queen's ship, the air grew cold enough to freeze breath. The guards reached for their pulse rifles, sensing their monarch's rising fury at the sight of her son being pelted with stones. But the Queen raised a clawed hand, her gaze fixed on the man who was bleeding for a boy he didn't know. She saw the way Elias's gait didn't change, the way his pace remained steady despite the pain. He was a pillar of salt and iron in a desert of cruelty. She saw more than a laborer. She saw a guardian who required no title. She began to wonder if the inferior creatures of Earth possessed a weapon her empire had long forgotten, the strength of a quiet heart. By the time they reached the water tower, the stars were beginning to pierce the purple canopy of the sky. Elias lowered Kyle onto his crate, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He handed the boy the half-full canteen, watching as Kyle drank with a desperate, frantic gratitude. Elias wiped the blood from his own face, the wound stinging in the cool night air. "See you tomorrow, kid," he said, turning to walk toward his lonely shack. He didn't see Kyle reach out a hand, a gesture of longing that stopped midair. The boy watched him go, his own heart heavy with the weight of a secret he couldn't speak, the knowledge that his people were coming, and that the man who saved him every morning might be the first to die in the fire. That night the Mojave was unnaturally still. There were no coyotes howling, no hum of the colony's generators. The air was thick with the static of 1,000 cloaked ships descending through the atmosphere. Elias lay on his cot, his body aching, his mind drifting toward the next morning. He calculated his remaining strength, wondering if he could manage the walk if the wind got worse. He fell into a restless sleep, dreaming of amber eyes and roads that never ended. He didn't hear the soft, metallic chime that echoed through the valley, nor did he see the light that began to bleed from the stars themselves, signaling that the time for observation had ended and the time for judgment had begun. The second week of the heatwave brought a tension to the colony that felt like a pulled wire ready to snap. Elias's boots were falling apart, the soles flapping against the hot dirt, yet his pace never slackened. On his back, Kyle seemed to be growing heavier, or perhaps it was just the mounting weight of the atmosphere. The boy had started making soft, melodic clicking sounds in Elias's ear, a language of distress that the man couldn't translate but deeply felt. The political climate between the humans and the star strays was reaching a boiling point. A shipment of rations had been lost at the docks, and the humans blamed the aliens' presence for the shortage. Every step Elias took with the royal heir was now a political statement, whether he intended it to be or not. The harassment intensified at the local diner, a rusted hub where miners gathered for synthetic protein and bitter ale. As Elias walked past the window with Kyle, the men inside would bang on the glass, their faces distorted by hate and hunger. "Laying down with the dogs, Elias," one yelled, the voice muffled but sharp. Elias didn't look. He felt Kyle's small hands grip his shirt so hard the fabric strained. The boy's fear was a physical thing, a cold dampness that seeped through Elias's shirt. Elias began to hum, a low, tuneless vibration in his chest meant to drown out the world. He was a shield, a human wall built of stubbornness and a refusal to let the world turn him into something he didn't recognize. One afternoon, a colonial official intercepted them. He was a man named Miller, dressed in a crisp uniform that didn't belong in the dust of the Mojave. He looked at Kyle with a clinical disgust, then at Elias with a pity that felt like an insult. "You're making the rest of us look bad, Elias," Miller said, blocking the path with his polished jeep. "Carrying that thing around like it's one of ours. It's a waste of resources. It's a waste of a good American back." Elias stopped, his eyes meeting Miller's. He didn't move the boy. He didn't apologize. "He's got a name," Elias said, his voice like grinding stones, "and he's got a class to get to. Move the truck." The silence that followed was heavy with the threat of violence. Miller laughed, a dry, hollow sound, but he moved the vehicle. As Elias walked past, he felt the weight of a dozen eyes on him from the nearby barracks. He was being marked, not just by his own kind, but by the unseen observers in the sky. Kyle whispered something then, a string of syllables that sounded like Sa-Ra-Ven, and for a moment the air around them seemed to shimmer with a faint golden hue. Elias felt a sudden surge of energy, his fatigue momentarily vanishing, as if a cool breeze had swept through his soul. He didn't know it was a blessing of the royal house, a small act of magic from a boy who could do nothing else to help his protector. Internal conflicts began to gnaw at Elias. At night, he looked at his shaking hands and wondered if he was being a fool. He was an old man in a young man's war, and he was risking his meager livelihood for a child who would likely never speak a word to him. Was it pride? Was it a need for penance? He thought of his own son, lost in the first wave of the invasion, a boy who had died alone in the rubble of Los Angeles. He realized then that carrying Kyle wasn't just about the boy, it was about the boy he couldn't carry 20 years ago. The grief was a phantom limb, and Kyle was the only thing that made the phantom stop aching. It was a selfish kind of kindness, Elias told himself, but it was the only thing he had left. The alien community was also in turmoil. Within the ghetto of the stars, Kyle's presence was a source of terrifying hope. They knew who he was, even if the humans didn't. They saw the Beast of Burden, their name for Elias, and they debated whether to kill him or worship him. To some, Elias was a kidnapper holding their prince hostage. To others, he was a miracle. A group of alien radicals, the Void Breakers, began to shadow Elias during his morning treks. They moved through the shadows of the ruins, their eyes glowing like dying embers. They were waiting for Elias to slip, waiting for a reason to spark the war that would bring the Queen's wrath down upon the colony, once and for all. One morning, the rain finally came, but it wasn't the rain the desert needed. It was a torrential, acidic downpour that turned the dust into a slick grey mire. The colony's drainage system failed immediately, and the road to the school became a treacherous river of mud. Elias didn't hesitate. He wrapped Kyle in a heavy, grease-stained tarp, securing the boy to his chest this time instead of his back. The water stung his skin and blurred his vision, but he pushed forward. He fell twice, his knees slamming into the hidden rocks beneath the sludge. Each time, he used his arms to cradle Kyle, ensuring the boy never touched the ground. He crawled until he could stand, his breath coming in wheezing sobs of effort. As he struggled through the mud, Elias saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was an alien woman, her skin shimmering with a nobility that seemed out of place in the slum. She was one of the Queen's hidden handmaidens, sent to test the man's resolve. She offered no help. Instead, she held out a handful of glimmer silk, a material worth more than the entire colony. "Give me the child," she said in a voice that echoed inside Elias's head. "Give him to me, and you will never hunger again. You can leave this dust and live in a palace of light." Elias looked at the silk, then at the terrified boy beneath the tarp. He didn't even slow down. "He's got school," Elias spat, stepping around her into the grey rain. The handmaiden disappeared into the mist, her report sent instantly to the orbiting spire. The Queen's curiosity was turning into a profound, unsettling respect. She had offered her subjects greatest treasures, yet the human had chosen a ritual of duty over a life of luxury. But she was a monarch, and she knew that the greatest tests were not of greed, but of survival. She signaled her commanders to begin the shadow phase. They would increase the pressure on the colony, cutting off the power and the water, pushing the humans to the brink of madness. She wanted to see if Elias's kindness was a habit of peace or a conviction of soul when the world truly began to bleed. The power went out that evening. The colony plunged into a terrifying absolute darkness, lit only by the flickering fires of rioters. Humans began to raid the alien sectors, fueled by fear and Miller's propaganda. Elias sat in his shack, a shotgun across his lap, listening to the screams in the distance. He thought of Kale, alone in that crate in the ghetto. He stood up, his body screaming in protest, and headed back out into the night. He didn't go to join the fight. He went to the ghetto. He found Kyle's home surrounded by a mob of humans with torches. They were looking for someone to blame for the dark, and the moon monsters were an easy target. Elias stepped into the light of the torches, his presence a sudden, jarring shock to the mob. He was a known figure, a man respected for his labor, if not for his choices. "Move aside, Elias," a miner named Silas growled. "We're cleaning out the rot." Elias didn't raise his gun. He simply stood in front of the door where Kyle was hiding. "There's no rot here," Elias said quietly. "Just a boy who can't walk. You want to get through this door, you go through me." The mob hesitated. There was something in Elias's eyes, a cold, terrifying certainty that made the fire in their torches seem dim. For a few minutes, the fate of the colony hung on a single man's refusal to move. Slowly, the mob dissipated, the men grumbling but unwilling to kill one of their own for a star stray. Elias stayed by the door until dawn, his back against the cold metal, watching the stars. He didn't see the boy's mother, the Queen, standing on the ridge above the ghetto, her silhouette hidden by the night. She watched the man who had protected her son from his own kind. She felt a strange, alien ache in her own chest, a realization that the bridge between their species wasn't built of treaties, but of the stubborn bones of a man who refused to be a monster. The caminos en conflito were narrowing, leading toward a precipice that would change everything. The morning of the breaking began with a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The mines had been shut down by the colonial government, and the air was thick with the smell of sulfur and ozone. Elias arrived at Kyle's crate, but the boy wasn't alone. Miller and 3 armed guards were there, their faces set in grim masks of authority. They were holding a deportation order, a flimsy piece of paper that authorized the immediate removal of all non-essential alien entities to a containment camp in the high desert, a place everyone knew was a death sentence. Kyle was huddled in his chair, his amber eyes wide with a terror that seemed to vibrate the very air. "Step aside, Elias," Miller said, his hand hovering over his holster. "This one is going to the camps. He's a drain on the system, and his legs make him useless for labor." Elias didn't move. He felt a cold, sharp anger crystallizing in his veins, a feeling he hadn't felt since the day his own son was taken by the chaos of the rift. He looked at Kyle, whose small hands were trembling so violently he could barely hold his satchel. "He's a child," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He isn't a drain. He's a human being's responsibility." Miller laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "He isn't human, Elias, that's the point. Now get out of the way before we charge you with treason." Elias did the unthinkable. He didn't just stay put. He stepped forward and scooped Kyle up into his arms, shielding him with his own body. The guards leveled their rifles, the hum of the energy cells whining in the quiet morning. "If you take him, you take me," Elias stated, his gaze never wavering. For a moment it seemed the world would end right there, in a spray of blue sparks and red blood. But the breaking didn't come from the guards. It came from the sky. A deafening roar shattered the silence as a scout ship, its hull shimmering with the royal crest of the Queen, tore through the clouds and hovered directly over the ghetto. The sheer force of its thrusters knocked the guards to the ground and sent Miller scurrying for cover. The ship didn't fire. Instead, a beam of pure, incandescent light descended, surrounding Elias and Kyle. Within the light, Elias felt a sensation of absolute peace, a sharp contrast to the violence of the world outside. He looked down at Kyle and saw the boy changing. The child's skin began to glow with a brilliant, internal luminescence, and his useless legs began to straighten, fueled by the proximity of the ship's energy. Kyle looked up at Elias, and for the first time he spoke, not in clicks or hums, but in a voice that sounded like 1,000 bells. "Thank you, Father of the Road," he whispered. The word father hit Elias harder than any rock ever had, a rupture of his emotional armor that left him gasping. Suddenly, the light vanished, and the ship ascended with a speed that defied physics. But they weren't gone. The sky began to darken as the main fleet, hundreds of massive, shadow-like vessels, decloaked over every major city on Earth. The message was clear. The Queen had seen enough. The breaking was the end of the masquerade. In the colony, the humans fell to their knees in terror, realizing that the refugees they had mocked were the vanguard of an empire that could snuff out their sun with a thought. Miller and his guards were frozen, their weapons useless pieces of scrap metal against the celestial might above. The rupture wasn't just in the sky, it was in the hearts of the colonists. The realization that they had been bullying royalty sent a wave of panic through the settlement. People began to turn on each other, some trying to find aliens to apologize to, others attempting to flee into the desert. Elias stood in the center of the chaos, still holding Kyle. The boy was different now. He was taller, his eyes burning with a regal authority that made Elias feel small. Kyle stood up on his own 2 feet, his legs healed by the ship's grace. He looked at Elias with a mixture of love and sorrow, knowing that the man's world was about to be torn apart by his mother's arrival. The Queen's voice then boomed from the heavens, translated into every human tongue through a psychic pulse that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. "People of Earth," she began, the sound both beautiful and terrifying. "I sent my son to die in your dust, to see if the embers of compassion still glowed in your dying race. I have watched you spit on the weak and mock the merciful. I have seen your cruelty, your greed, and your hate." The sky turned a deep, angry crimson. "But I have also seen one man who carried the weight of a prince without asking for the weight of a crown." The tension in the colony reached a breaking point. A group of desperate miners, led by a panicked Silas, rushed toward Elias and Kyle, thinking that if they could capture the boy, they could bargain for their lives. Elias reacted with an instinct born of years of hard labor and loss. He swung his heavy satchel, knocking Silas back, and stood over Kyle like a wounded lion. "Stay back!" he roared. But he was one man against a dozen. A miner lunged with a rusted knife, the blade catching Elias in the side. He grunted, the pain a hot iron in his ribs, but he didn't fall. He shoved the boy behind him, his blood staining the red dust of the road they had traveled so many times. At that moment, the ground itself seemed to scream. A massive rift opened in the center of the colony, and the Queen herself emerged. She was a towering figure of crystalline armor and flowing shadows, her presence so immense that the air grew thin. She didn't look at the mob, she didn't look at the guards. She looked at Elias, who was clutching his side, his face pale, but his eyes still defiant. She saw his blood on the ground, human blood spilled to protect her son. The Aquebra was complete. The wall between the two species had been shattered by the violence of the mob and the sacrifice of the laborer. Kyle ran to his mother, but he didn't stop there. He pointed back at Elias, his voice urgent and filled with tears. The Queen knelt, a gesture that caused the very foundations of the colony to tremble. To see a god-queen kneel before a bleeding miner was a sight that would be burned into the collective memory of humanity forever. She reached out a clawed, elegant hand and touched Elias's wound. The pain vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, tingling sensation. "You are more than your kind," she whispered, her voice now soft, echoing in his mind. "You carried my heart when I was too far to reach it, but the breaking was not without its price. The Queen's mercy did not extend to the rest of the colony. Her guards, shimmering warriors of light, descended and began to round up the men who had thrown stones, and the officials who had signed the deportation orders. The sky was filled with the sounds of screams and the hum of transport beams. The colony was being dismantled, its structures dissolved into dust. Elias watched in horror as his world was erased, realizing that his act of kindness had saved him, but might have doomed his people. The duality of his position, savior and witness to destruction, tore at his psyche. As the sun began to set on the ruins of the Mojave colony, Elias stood alone with the Queen and the Prince. The dust was settling, and the silence had returned. But it was a different silence now, the silence of a graveyard or a new world being born. The Queen looked at the horizon, where the lights of the human cities were flickering out one by one. She turned back to Elias, her expression unreadable. "The test is over, Elias of Earth. Your species has failed, but you have endured." She offered him a choice that would seal the consequences of the next chapter: to stay and witness the end of his world, or to ascend and become something more than human. The aftermath of the Queen's descent left the Mojave in a state of eerie, post-apocalyptic stillness. The colony was gone, not destroyed by fire, but simply unmade, its materials reclaimed by the alien technology. Elias found himself standing on a plateau of smooth, glass-like obsidian where the slums once stood. Around him, the Star Strays were being led onto massive transport ships, their faces no longer fearful but radiant. The humans who had been spared were huddled in groups, their spirits broken by the sudden revelation of their insignificance. Elias felt a profound sense of displacement. He was a man without a country, a laborer whose tools were now obsolete in a world ruled by gods. Elias's body felt strange. The Queen's touch had done more than heal his wound. It had infused his cells with a vitality that made his old aches feel like distant memories. Yet his mind was a storm of guilt. He walked among the survivors, offering what little food he had left, but they looked at him with a mixture of awe and resentment. To them, he was the Queen's pet, the man whose strange hobby had brought the end of their way of life. He realized that the quiet kindness he had practiced in secret was now a public spectacle that separated him from his own kind. The consequences of his virtue were a loneliness more profound than the one he had inhabited before Kyle. Kyle, now restored to his full stature and dressed in silks that shimmered like nebulae, visited Elias every evening. They no longer walked the dusty road, but sat on the edge of the obsidian plateau, looking out over the darkened earth. Kyle tried to explain the Queen's plan, a great reordering, where humanity would be tutored in the ways of the higher dimensions, their weapons stripped away and their societies rebuilt from the ground up. To Kyle, it was a gift. To Elias, it felt like a benevolent invasion. "You saved me, Elias," Kyle would say, his voice now deep and resonant. "Now my mother will save your world." Elias would only sigh, his heart heavy with the loss of human agency. The psychological toll on Elias was devastating. He missed the grit, the struggle, and even the heat of the old Mojave. He missed the feeling of Kyle's small weight on his back, the tangible evidence of a burden that made sense. Now, everything was weightless and sterile. He watched as the Queen's architects began to grow towers of light out of the desert floor, structures that defied gravity and reason. He felt like a caged animal in a golden zoo, a specimen of goodness being preserved for study. The Queen would often watch him from a distance, her presence a constant, heavy reminder that he was the reason she hadn't simply wiped the planet clean. One night, Miller, the former official, approached Elias in the shadows. He was haggard, his uniform in tatters, his eyes burning with a desperate, manic light. "You have to talk to her, Elias," Miller hissed, grabbing the man's arm with a strength born of terror. "They're taking us to the cradles. They say it's for education, but we know it's for storage. You're the only one she listens to. Tell her we're sorry. Tell her we'll work harder. Just give us our world back." Elias looked at the man who had once threatened to kill him and felt nothing but a weary pity. "It isn't about work anymore, Miller," Elias said. "It was never about work. It was about how we treated the one who couldn't work." The realization that his species was being re-educated because of his own actions created a deep rupture in Elias's sense of self. He began to wonder if he should have let Kyle walk or crawl alone. If he had been as cruel as the others, would the Queen have simply left them to their own devices? Was his kindness a betrayal of human freedom? These thoughts haunted him as he wandered the halls of the Queen's flagship, a place of shifting geometries and singing walls. He was a ghost in the machine, a primitive soul lost in a sea of advanced consciousness. He felt the weight of billions of lives on his shoulders, a burden far greater than one small boy. The Queen finally summoned him to the throne of echoes. She sat amidst a swirl of starlight, her form more fluid and terrifying than before. "You are unhappy, Elias of Earth," she stated, the words vibrating in his teeth. "I have given your world peace. I have ended hunger and disease. I have removed the predators from your streets. Why do you mourn?" Elias stood before her, a small man in a tattered jacket, and looked her in the eyes. "Because you took the struggle," he said. "We're messy, and we're cruel, and we're stupid sometimes, but we're trying to find our own way. You're not teaching us to be kind. You're forcing us to be quiet." The Queen's eyes flared with a cold blue fire. "Quiet is better than violent," she countered. "I saw them throw stones at my son. I saw them point rifles at a child. They do not deserve the way they were finding." Elias stepped closer, his voice cracking with emotion. "And what about the ones who didn't throw stones? What about the ones who were just trying to survive? You're judging a whole forest by a few rotten trees." The Queen went silent, the shadows around her pulsing with her agitation. She had expected gratitude. She hadn't expected a lecture from the very creature she had come to admire. As the days turned into weeks, the consequences became physical. The Earth's atmosphere began to change, cleaned of human pollutants, turning the sky a vibrant, alien teal. The cities were being repurposed, the old structures replaced by living, bioluminescent habitats. Elias watched as his species was slowly integrated into the Andromeda hegemony, their culture being erased in favor of a higher truth. He saw Kyle becoming more distant, the prince reclaiming his duties and his cold royal heritage. The boy who had leaned his head on Elias's shoulder was gone, replaced by a leader who looked at humans as a project rather than as peers. Elias decided he couldn't stay in the Towers of Light. He took a small pack of supplies and began to walk, not toward the cities, but back into the deep desert, toward the places the Queen's architects hadn't yet reached. He wanted to find the dust again. He wanted to feel the sun burn his skin without an atmospheric shield. He was followed by a small group of dissidents, humans who refused the gifts of the Queen. They looked to Elias as a leader, but he refused the title. "I'm just a man who carries things," he told them. "I'm not a king and I'm not a savior." The Queen watched him leave, her heart, or whatever organ served as such, feeling a strange, sharp pang of loss. She could have forced him to stay, could have rewritten his mind to make him happy, but she realized that doing so would destroy the very thing she valued in him. His stubborn, irrational will to do what he thought was right, regardless of the cost. She ordered her guards to leave him alone, to let the man of the road walk his own path in the wild places of the world. She would let him be the last true human, a living relic of a species that had been both too cruel and too kind for its own good. The chapter ends with Elias standing on a ridge, looking back at the shimmering spires of the new Earth. He felt the weight of his pack on his shoulders, a familiar grounding sensation. He was alone, yet he felt a strange sense of peace. He had done his duty to the boy, and now he was doing his duty to himself. He turned his back on the light and began to walk into the shadows of the old world, a nomad in a land that was no longer his, carrying the memory of a boy who was once a prince and a prince who was once a boy. The consequences of his kindness had changed the galaxy, but they had also returned him to the dust from which he came. Years had passed since the day the sky opened, and the world was now a tapestry of two realities. The bright cities hummed with the advanced technology of the hegemony, while the wilds remained the refuge of those who clung to the old ways. Elias had become a legend, a ghost story told by both species. He lived in a canyon deep in the Mojave, where the red rocks provided a natural sanctuary from the Queen's censors. His hair was white now, his skin like parched leather, but his eyes remained sharp, clear, and filled with a quiet, unyielding fire. He had built a small school in the ruins of an abandoned observatory, teaching the children of the wilds about history, music, and the importance of a weight shared. One morning, as the sun began to paint the canyon in shades of ochre and blood, a lone figure appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a human scavenger or a colonial guard. It was a tall, elegant being draped in a cloak of liquid gold. As the figure approached, Elias felt a familiar hum in the air, a vibration he hadn't felt in a decade. It was Kyle. The prince had returned, not as a conqueror or a student, but as a man, or the alien equivalent of one. He looked at the modest schoolhouse, at the tattered books and the hand-carved benches, and he smiled. It was a human smile, learned long ago on a dusty road to a shipping container. "The Queen is dying, Elias," Kyle said, his voice echoing through the canyon. The news hit Elias with unexpected force. The immortal monarch, the being who had unmade the world, was fading. "Her light is returning to the source. She has named me her successor, but I cannot rule the way she did. I cannot rule by judgment alone." Kyle stepped into the schoolhouse, his presence making the small room seem grander. "She spent her final years watching you. She couldn't understand why you chose the dust over the stars, and in her final moments she realized that she was the one who was disabled, not me. Elias sat on a weathered bench, gesturing for Kyle to join him. She had power, Kyle. Power makes you blind to the things that don't have it. Kyle nodded, his amber eyes shimmering. She wants to see you one last time, not as a subject, but as a teacher. She wants to know how to let go. Elias looked at his calloused hands, the hands that had carried a prince and built a life out of ruins. He realized that the resolution of his story wasn't just about his own peace. It was about the final bridge between two vastly different ways of being. He stood up, his old bones protesting, and grabbed his coat. "Then let's go," he said. "I've got one more journey in me." They traveled to the capital, a city of crystal that pierced the clouds. Elias was led through halls of light that made his eyes ache, past warriors who bowed as he passed. He found the queen in a chamber of absolute silence, her form flickering like a guttering candle. She was no longer a towering god. She was small, fragile, and translucent. She looked at Elias, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes, the universal fear of the unknown that comes at the end of all things. She reached out a hand, and Elias, without hesitation, took it. His rough, warm skin against her cold, shifting essence was the final act of the great alliance. "Tell me," the queen whispered, her voice a faint rustle of wind. "How did you carry him every day, knowing the road was long and the reward was nothing?" Elias leaned in close, his voice steady. It wasn't about the reward, it was about the walk. When you carry someone, you're not just moving them from one place to another, you're telling them they're worth the effort. You're telling them they're not alone. That's all any of us really want, Queen, to know that someone will pick us up when our legs won't carry us. The queen closed her eyes, a single tear of liquid starlight falling down her cheek. "I see," she breathed. "The strength is in the surrender." As the queen dissolved into light, a pulse of energy rippled out from the capital, reaching every corner of the earth. It wasn't a pulse of command, but of connection. For a brief moment, every human and every alien felt what Elias felt. The memory of the road, the heat of the sun, and the weight of a shared burden. The great reordering shifted. The cradles were opened, the restrictions lifted. The hegemony didn't leave, but they stopped being masters. They became partners, learners, and friends. The era of judgment was over. The era of the carried had begun. Kyle was crowned under a sky that had returned to its natural blue, a gesture of respect to the man who had taught him the value of his own world. His first act as king was to declare the Mojave a sacred land, not for its minerals or its beauty, but for its dust. He built a monument on the obsidian plateau where the colony had stood. It wasn't a statue of a god or a queen. It was a simple bronze sculpture of a man in a laborer's jacket, with a small boy on his back. The inscription was written in both languages. "The strongest alliances are forged in silence." Elias returned to his canyon, refusing any title or palace. He spent his final years teaching the children of both species, side by side, in his small schoolhouse. He became a bridge that people crossed to find their own humanity. He was no longer the queen's pet or the ghost of the Mojave. He was simply Elias. On the day he died, he was sitting on his porch, watching the sunset. He didn't die in pain. He simply let go, his work finished. The entire world, from the bright cities to the deepest wilds, fell silent for a full minute, a global moment of weightlessness for the man who had carried so much. The story ends not with a grand battle, but with a small, quiet scene. A young human boy and a young alien child are walking along a dusty road in the Mojave. The alien boy trips, his spindly legs tangling in the brush. Without a word, the human boy stops, turns around, and offers his back. "Where are we going?" the alien boy asks as he climbs on. The human boy smiles, his eyes reflecting the amber of the setting sun. "To school," he says. "Don't worry, I've got you." As they walk away into the horizon, the spirit of Elias lives on in the simple, repeated rhythm of their footsteps, a quiet kindness that will echo for eternity.